One thing that is very important to trying to respond to gray zone threats, but also to create a sort of a security architecture in the Indo-Pacific region is amphibious capability. And what I mean by that is the ability of ground, sea, and air forces to cooperate and conduct operations both on sea and onto land and vice versa. And this is something which is really an underreported subtext of the defense development, security developments in the Indo-Asia-Pacific region over the last few years. And particularly the Japanese have made tremendous strides in developing this capability, almost going from a standing start. The Australians as well have done a lot in this regard and are moving along quickly. And you've got at least a dozen other nations which either have some level of capability or want to have the capability. And when I say it creates stability, what I mean is that it gives a country more confidence when it's able to conduct that sort of three-dimensional joint operations. But also it gives us the opportunity to get away from the traditional U.S. military hub and spoke relationship, where the U.S. in Asia does amphibious training with individual countries. If you think of a wheel with spokes. And what you have when the other countries are now capable of performing these military activities, which actually are the most appropriate given the geography and the terrain of the region, which is largely maritime with a lot of land. You now have the opportunity or the possibility of the spokes to actually start interacting together. And I would suggest, for example, that if a Japanese amphibious force starts to work directly with an Indian amphibious force, the Australians working directly with the Singaporeans, you could have the Taiwanese actually getting into the mix. The Koreans could operate with the Philippines, even with out in the Indian Ocean. If you actually diagram this, you have this network of almost cross-hatching, almost a web of amphibious relationships, which actually present a very tough challenge for an adversary trying to penetrate this. Whereas if it is simply a single service capability, that is something that really isn't connected very well. That is much easier to split. So I would say that this question of amphibiosity, of amphibious development, is an underreported subtext, but it's also something which it gives it gives U.S. forces a real lift, because we have very limited amphibious capabilities. This has become very clear recently. And when you get our partners and our allies who are now able to operate in a more useful way, this creates a relationship and it enhances our resources in the region. So I would stress that it's rare that a military capability actually has a strategic effect, and particularly a political effect, possibly. It'd be ironic if ASEAN development or political development was actually spurred by the amphibious capability development of certain ASEAN nations. So that is, when thinking about gray zone threats or just how you deal with the challenges we face in the South China Sea, the East China Sea, that the development of an amphibious capability, I would suggest, is actually as important as things like the F-35 being introduced, more submarines being posted in the region, but simply taking existing resources, learning how to operate jointly, and developing an amphibious capability is something, I say, which has been generally underemphasized, but is very important.